Welcome to Practicing Life podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Pitzer. Today, I want to talk about the difference between denial and seeing things as you want to see them. I help a lot of people that are esoteric or on the spiritual side. Let's take religion out of this because that is not what I work with. I just work on the esoteric side of things, which is also very science-based. So obviously, as a hypnotist, I talk a lot about the brain. And in this spiritual world, you may have heard the saying that you should see things not as they are, but as you want to see them. My mentor, Jim Fortin, is one of the people who say that, and it's something that I hear all the time. But I recently had an experience happen in my life where I sat back and I questioned, am I in denial right now? And it made me ponder, like, what is the difference? And that's why we are talking about it today. So, denial is not wanting to see reality. It's a defense mechanism, and it's often used to avoid anxiety. So, when you see things as you want to see them, this is what I would call an empowered choice. It is when you are choosing how you want to see things. So, there's a famous quote out there, and I'm going to butcher this person's name, but Anais Nin, I'm going to say that Anais. This person wrote a quote that we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. So this comes down to my NLP training, my neuro linguistic programming. And in that, again, science-based, this is about our perception creates our reality. So what does that mean? That means that each person sees life through their filters. This is standard for everybody, no exceptions. We all have filters. This is how our brain works. So each person sees life through their filters, and their filters are things like their belief, their identity, all of these preconceptions that they have been taught since they are a childhood. So it is truly their identity that they are seeing things through. So let's just point something out. The perception of somebody who is rich and the perception of somebody who is poor is going to be very different if, let's say, you're discussing purchasing an investment, right? The identity of the person that is poor is going to have different ways of thinking and processing and analyzing this decision and whether or not they can do it and are they worthy compared to somebody who is rich. They are going to be thinking like differently in the sense of like, is this even worth it? Will I get my return on investment? Like, is, whatever. Both people are going to see the same situation, the same circumstances differently. And that is your perception. So if I were to say something like, this is a problem, it may not be a problem to you. So if I said that having curly hair is a problem, well, somebody that doesn't have curly hair may not think it's a problem, and somebody with curly hair may not think it's a problem. That's perception. It is very individualized. And so one of the things that I hear a lot of times, especially with this word around trauma, like we are in trigger words, and there is this like self-pity, type of mentality, this victim mentality that a majority of people have. I have it at times, and I definitely was like living in it like I was swimming in a pool before I started doing a lot of transformation work. But if you struggle to see the good in life, it isn't because good doesn't exist. It is because who you are. It is your perception. It's how you are filtering things. And there is something called confirmation bias. This is where your brain, it loves you and it loves being right. And it's going to go and it's going to search for evidence to show you and to prove to you that you are right. So it goes back to that one quote, whether or not you think you are right or wrong, you are. I think Henry Ford said something along this, right? Well, whether you think you're right or you're wrong, you're right. Like the whole point is whatever stories you are telling yourself, whatever interpretations you are making, that is your reality and that is true to you. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, I'm not a political person by any means, but I feel like maybe one day I will be, because sometimes I'm getting a little bit like drawing the line in the sand with people expressing their perceptions and telling other people that they have to have the same perceptions in the political world. And that is like, that's just control. At the end of it is just control. That doesn't mean there isn't validity to what they are asking for or wanting from other people, but we all have different pasts. We all have different stories that we have been fed to from a child when we weren't able to critically think for ourselves and we didn't have analyzing skills, and everything that we learned was the absolute truth and nothing but the truth, right? Those are undisputable things in your brain until you become an adult and you start to question that. And adults don't always question things that they learned in their childhood. Heck, I can't even remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday, let alone like something that my parents told me as a child, or my, elementary teacher told me. I'll give you a little side thing here, right? Like this is how perception works. As a author, I will have somebody read my book and they will tell me things like, no, it is a rule that you cannot start a sentence with but. Well, that's something that you learned in school. And there's actually not a legitimate rule around that for nonfiction writers. So this is a reality to them, and they may view me as a poor writer because I start a sentence with but, when in fact there is data and research showing that starting a sentence with but makes a reader more engaged and more relatable. They get pulled more into the story when it is used correctly. But I won't argue with somebody on their perception if they think that you shouldn't start a sentence with a but. That is the way they think. And I don't try to control them and I don't argue with them. And I just like express myself of like, thank you for sharing that. And then I move on and I don't make it a problem. So if you are struggling to see good in your life, what is that one comment? This is a comment my husband used to say, and it used to irk me, but he would say something like, no good deed goes unpunished, which that statement, that story, that belief would then work against you for doing any good deed, because, well, if I do a good deed, that means that I believe that I'm going to be punished in some way, that it's going to come back and bite me in the butt. So your perception is individual and unique to you. And though many people can share similar perceptions, nobody is going to have 100% identical perception to you. Even if you had a twin, your twin is going to have different experiences and come up with different reality than you. This is one of the reasons why in like courts or in trials, you will see people who had witness the exact same event and have a different story about it. And there's so many things that happen. One of my favorite episodes on Oprah was when the people were outside waiting to be let into the studio. They had a fake, actor scenario situation where an actor portrayed a thief and came up and grabbed a woman's purse, also an actress, and took off running. And they asked every single person in line, like a police report, what did they see? What was the person wearing? What was their height? Whatever. And so there's hundreds of people in this line, and no one correctly identified the person. They all had different perceptions. Every single one saw the exact same scenario, but everybody's perceptions, their filters, their identity made it out to be slightly different. So, in my personal opinion, I would say that all perceptions are distorted. And again, I'm going to relate this back. If you didn't listen to my last episode, I'm going to relate this back to how your brain works. So if you're walking into a dark room and you have a flashlight, that beam of light is your consciousness, and it's what you are able to see and what you are able to focus on. Now you can move that flashlight all over the room. You could point it to the corner, you could point it to the ceiling, you could point it to the floor. You have control over what you are focusing on based on your consciousness being directed in a certain way. But your consciousness, that beam of light, isn't able to light the entire room up. So your subconscious is like the room, and it can see everything. It doesn't need the light. It is aware of everything. It is containing everything in that room. And your consciousness gets to decide what it wants to focus on. So this is where your perceptions are coming from. They're coming from your past, and they're coming from what you are choosing to focus on. And then you have something called that confirmation bias, which wants to prove you right. Everybody likes to be right. It feels icky to be wrong. And some people have a physiological response to being wrong because they make it mean that they are bad. So they really are attached to being right. Let's get this back to denial. So one of the things that I sat back and I asked myself when a situation happened is I have learned to become a person who chooses to see things as they want to see things. And I had a situation happen, and in this moment, I was reflecting on the fact that this is not the first time that this situation has happened. And I was asking myself, because this is a repeated lesson, am I in denial? What is it that I am not seeing and I'm not learning from that is causing the situation to repeat in my life? Now, whether I'm in denial or whether it is that I'm empowering myself, there were some key things that I mentioned in there: reflection, learning my life lessons. Those are things that I believe separate the difference between denial. But let's stop here and say, in denial, what is happening is you are minimizing what you are perceiving so that you can avoid feeling an uncomfortable feeling or handling a challenging situation. So the key is that in denial, you are minimizing to avoid. We live in a world where certain emotions just don't feel good to feel. Our brain, again, is very primitive, and it goes towards pleasure and away from pain. So when a painful or really challenging situation happens, denial is a coping mechanism. I'm not making, denial a right or wrong situation. I'm educating you and I'm empowering you. So I'm not saying that going into denial is a bad thing to do. Staying in denial, I would say, is going to have long-term consequences. And that would be a sign that you are in denial. A sign is that when you refuse to feel a feeling, and this is where a lot of coaching, it doesn't have to be me and my coaching where I'm helping people deal with the relationship with themselves. But in coaching, a lot of times the reason that you go to a coaching is because self-talk didn't work. Dragging out your past and discussing it over and over didn't work. And in reality, you go to a coach and they help you feel safe, feeling certain feelings that you have probably been taught or have been taught that are bad, or you just from a primitive brain space, you don't like that feeling. You don't like the changes happening in your body. Like, for instance, when I was a personal trainer, tons of people didn't like to work out because they had a story and an interpretation that they didn't like sweat. Like, sweat made them feel dirty. It made them feel icky. And so they would avoid working out because of the natural response of what your body does to release heat from your body. So sweating isn't a bad thing, but their interpretation of it was that it was a bad thing. And this is kind of the same thing. When you're refusing to feel a feeling, which all feelings are meant to be felt, that feeling kind of gets suppressed, and then you start having even more painful physiological responses in your body. And so that can cue your brain to just don't think about this, don't feel this, minimize it, like this isn't happening. So another sign of denial is this false cheerfulness. So some signs of denial are going to be you're detached from the situation. Again, this is a coping skill. And especially if you have had or having a traumatic experience, detaching is a way to cope. I'm not saying this is right. I'm not saying this is wrong. This is just something that happens if you stay in a detached state. The long-term consequences is you have parts of you. And I see this in my hypnotizing profession. And it's actually one of my favorite things to do is to help people with parts. But parts is where you will say literally out loud, a part of me wants to do this, a part of me doesn't. A part of me feels good about this, a part of me doesn't. This happens because you never went back and did that reflection and felt your feelings when you felt safe to feel them. And so it gets trapped. And then there's this different side of you, that coping mechanism that forms in you to handle the situation, but it stays with you. So you have detachment, you have indifference, you have this false cheerfulness, you refuse to feel a feeling, and it gets worse over time. Those are some of the signs of denial. So when we think back to the statement of see things as you want to see them, which is a lot of the spiritual world will recommend, you will also hear things like Napoleon Hill. He wrote, trying to think what he wrote. Seeing is not believing. Believing is seeing. So you have these types of mindsets and these mentalities, right? That are very empowering. Like, oh, all I have to do to change my future is to continue to see things as I want to see them. That is super empowering. It can be quite different if you set with your body and you set with your emotions. There are very vast difference in your emotions of looking at it from denial, not feeling those feelings, letting those feelings be trapped in your body versus the feelings of this happened, but this is what I would choose to have happen in the future. So what is the difference? Acceptance. That's the first thing. The second thing is learning from your lessons. And the third thing is controlling what you can control. So what is acceptance? Acceptance is acknowledging what happened and feeling your feelings. I'm going to make it that simple. So something happens to you and your interpretation of it is, I don't like that this happened. This is causing me stress, blah, blah, blah. In that moment, you sit with those emotions, you acknowledge how they feel. So in my career, I also work for a transformation company, right? And I made a mistake. And so when I made this mistake, emotions, my body immediately responded. I don't like making mistakes, right? I'm human. I don't like making mistakes, but everybody makes mistakes. They're just part of learning. And so even though I logically know this, my body had an emotional response. I made a mistake. And then I can feel the alarm, the fight or flight symptoms in my body. So I acknowledged, hey, I did in fact make this mistake. I feel these feelings. I let myself feel them. I let myself have a pity party. I let myself have the emotions. And then when I had my stop point, because I'm not going to stay in that emotion, that's my choice. And I would advise you as well not to stay in that emotions. But once I have enough time to sit with those emotions, then I transferred my emotions. And this is what I kind of help my clients do. But then I transferred my emotions. And then afterwards, I made a choice. So I controlled what I can control and I learned my lesson. That's my choice part. So at that point, I was like, what lesson can I learn from this? What can I take away? What can I do differently? What was something that would benefit me from this experience? So for instance, one of the things that you control is your interpretations. So I decided to congratulate myself that I made a mistake. And I did. I was like, Ashley, good job. Now you know this, and this only makes you a better employee. This only makes you more gifted at what you do. I'm like, that is freaking awesome. Right. So I controlled my narrative, my talk to myself, and I made a decision about how I wanted to look at this and how I wanted to feel about this. So I accepted the situation. I didn't deny that I made a mistake. I didn't run away from it. I acknowledged that I made a mistake. I owned it. I sat with it. I felt my feelings. I decided the things that I could do differently next time to avoid this from asking. And that involved me asking my boss questions like, would you like me to do this in this situation? Like, what is the distinction between this and this? So I got the clarity that I needed so that I could execute this, thing in the future differently. And then that last step is I controlled my narrative. I controlled what I can control, which is my interpretation, my story, my narrative, my self-talk. And I made it something empowering. And this to me is seeing things as you want to see them. So we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are because of our identity. So in my past identity, if I made a mistake, I would have probably been one, I would have owned it because that was just who I was. And I will say that I had a self-deprecating personality in the past before I really did transformation work. So in the past, I would have owned it because I owned people's mistakes that weren't even my mistakes. If I was in a cubicle and the person 3 cubicles down from me made a mistake and I had nothing to do with their job, I would have stepped in and been like, well, I could have helped them. I could have done this. This would have been avoided if I did this. So that was a self-deprecating, and I took responsibility for everything. So I would have taken accountability, but the difference would have been is that I wouldn't have liked how I felt, and I would have judged myself, and I would have beat myself up. That's who I was in the past. And who I am now, when I was going through my mistake yesterday, I stopped and I said to myself repeatedly, because those old patterns exist. And I am the person responsible for making the decision to refuse to go down that path. So go back to that flashlight. It is my responsibility to shine that light on what I want to shine it on. So I could have shined it on my past path, and I could have went down that path of beating myself up over and over, but I chose to shine my flashlight on I am a person who loves myself. I love myself. This is a mistake, and mistakes are nothing but feedback. This feedback helps me. This is all within your power and your control too. So acceptance is a really big part of this. Sitting back and reflecting, that is where you learn your life lessons. Without that reflection piece, you're just moving forward and you're more likely to repeat the same circumstance and live from your circumstance. So I know I'm repeating a lot today, but you accept it. You feel your feelings. That's part of acceptance. You acknowledge that it happened. That's part of acceptance. You learn from your lessons. That's step 2. That involves reflecting. Okay. And the third thing is you control what you can control. And this is why there's a difference between denial, which is avoiding, and seeing things as you want to see them, which is choosing. And one of the things that I would tell you is that there is a difference between acceptance and resignation. So in resignation, you are also having acceptance, but the difference is you're saying that even though this happened, and even though I allow myself to feel these feelings, nothing can change. I'm stuck here. Like, this is all that this is. Like, and I've said this myself. I'll say things like, well, this is just my life. With having a kid who needs caregiving 24/7, there are times that I've gotten into my self-pity in the past, especially. And I would say, well, this is just my life, like as if nothing could change, as if I couldn't do anything differently. I wasn't allowing myself to have options and choices. I was looking at things as black and white, the best circumstance and the worst circumstance. And there was nothing in between. There was no gray area. And that is how I functioned in the past. So resignation is when you're just like, well, nothing can change. So you accept it and you may make peace with it, but you're not taking that next step of altering your future, which comes back to controlling what you can, those stories, changing where your flashlight is pointed. You have that power. You have that responsibility. So I hope this was helpful for you. Please leave comments and questions. And as always, you matter.